New York City's yellow cabs are more than just a way to get around. They're a symbol. Just like the Statue of Liberty, Times Square, or the Empire State Building, those bright yellow taxis are part of the Big Apple's DNA. From Travis Bickle's checker cab and taxi driver to the long reign of Chevy Caprices and the legendary Ford Crown Victorias, the story of New York's taxis has always been one of American cars for the American melting pot. But the thing is, like everything else in this city, the story didn't stay the same forever. And to really understand why New York's taxi scene shifted, you've got to rewind the clock to the early 1970s. For decades, Americans had been living large on cheap gas. Big cars, big engines, no worries about fuel economy. Checker's A-Series taxis were perfect for the time, powered by robust Chevy inline sixes and even V8s like the 283 and 327 small blocks. These cars were workhorses, built to last, and for years they completely dominated the taxi market. Checker didn't just build the cars, they ran the taxi service too. It was a monopoly, and in New York, Checker ruled the streets. But there had been experiments. Back in the late 1950s, Plymouth teamed up with English engine maker Perkins to try out diesel taxis in New York. These Perkins-powered cars had a little four-cylinder diesel that cranked out 60 horsepower and revved to about 3,000 RPM. They were economical, sure, but they were also noisy, smoky, and painfully slow. New Yorkers didn't want clattery diesels. They wanted smooth, powerful gas engines. So, gasoline reigned supreme, until it didn't. October 1973 changed everything. Israel fought the Yom Kippur War against a coalition of Middle Eastern countries, many of whom were part of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. In retaliation for Western support for Israel, OPEC cut off oil exports. Overnight, the price of oil skyrocketed by 300%. In the US, drivers lined up at gas stations for hours, and sometimes pumps simply ran dry. Suddenly, those big V8 taxis weren't looking so practical anymore. Car manufacturers scrambled, consumers turned to smaller, more fuel-efficient imports, and America entered what became known as the Malaise era. Detroit's Big Three struggled to adapt, and in New York, taxi buyers faced a problem too. Checker's monopoly was already under pressure from antitrust cases, and by the early 1970s, the A-Series no longer had the same grip on the market. Taxi drivers and fleet owners were desperate for cars that could handle the oil crisis. And the answer came from a place nobody expected: France. Enter the Peugeot 504. This car had been in production since 1969 and had already made a name for itself by winning European Car of the Year. Designed by Pininfarina, it was elegant, comfortable, and above all, reliable. Best of all, it came with a diesel option. In the early 1970s, if you wanted a diesel car, your main choices were Peugeot or Mercedes-Benz. Both were great, but Mercedes came with a hefty price tag. Peugeot, on the other hand, was affordable, tough, and perfectly suited for taxi work. Under the hood, Peugeot's diesels came from Indinor, a company that originally built small marine engines. These engines were simple four-cylinders, 2-liter, 2.1-liter, or 2.3-liter depending on the model, producing between 50 and 65 horsepower. They weren't fast, but they were bulletproof. Compared to the old Perkins diesels that Plymouth had tried in the 50s, Peugeot's engines were far smoother, more reliable, and refined. And with fuel economy being the name of the game, suddenly New York cabbies had a real reason to take notice. Peugeot already had a US dealer network, so getting cars wasn't a problem. The 504 had been federalized with sealed beam headlights and 5-mile-per-hour bumpers to meet American regulations. So by the mid-1970s, Peugeot taxis started showing up on New York streets. Not in huge numbers at first, but enough to turn heads. By 1981, Peugeot introduced the 505, a more modern, sleeker version built on the same foundations. That year alone, there were 850 Peugeot taxis working the streets of New York, and Peugeot's US sales manager hoped to hit 1,200 by the end of the year. For a foreign brand in America's most American city, that was a big deal. But there were challenges. As the Peugeot 504 and later the 505 gained traction in New York, they seemed like the perfect solution to the oil crisis era. reliable, efficient, and a whole lot easier on the fuel budget than those thirsty American V8s. But New York City isn't like anywhere else in the world, and soon the cracks began to show. For starters, size mattered. Compared to the massive Chevys and Fords Americans were used to, the Peugeot felt small. Back then, foreign cars weren't just seen as different, they were seen as cramped. Taxi passengers would sometimes wave off a Peugeot 505, choosing to wait for a bigger, more familiar American cab that could swallow all their shopping bags, luggage, or even just give them more breathing room in the back seat. Then there was the issue of parts. Sure, Peugeot had a dealer network in the States, but it wasn't like walking into a GM or Ford parts counter. Mechanics were used to American cars, and when something broke on a Peugeot, drivers often complained about long waits for repairs or the higher cost of parts compared to domestic brands. For a New York taxi driver, time is money, and waiting around for a European part shipment just wasn't practical. And fuel, ironically, was another problem. Diesel wasn't as common in the US as gasoline. In New York, there were far fewer diesel pumps than gas stations, and drivers sometimes had to queue up for ages just to refuel. In a business where every extra minute spent at the pump meant lost fares, that was a major downside. So, while the Peugeot taxis were mechanically excellent and proved their durability, New Yorkers weren't entirely sold. They wanted cars that were easy to fix, easy to fuel, and big enough to haul whatever life in the city demanded. Slowly but surely, Peugeot began to lose ground. By the mid-1980s, the tide had turned. Chevrolet's Caprice and Ford's Crown Victoria stepped in, offering exactly what cab drivers and fleet owners needed. Big, body-on-frame American sedans that could take endless abuse and keep running. Parts were cheap, mechanics knew them inside and out, and passengers felt right at home in the back seat. The Caprice and Crown Vic became icons of New York, their silhouettes as recognizable as the skyline itself. Peugeot's short-lived experiment faded, remembered only by a handful of enthusiasts and cabbies who appreciated the French diesel's quirks. But history wasn't done reshaping the streets of New York. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the landscape changed again. Rising fuel costs and environmental concerns put pressure on the old gas-guzzling sedans.